I keep seeing these videos and posts of people claiming they were followed around at a Target or Walmart by a would-be trafficker, and somehow they always manage to escape. To me, these claims seem to conjure up scenes from the movie Taken or an organized crime group that is lurking in the shadows, ready to kidnap us or our kids as we unsuspectedly shop. And while some of these stories are no doubt true, and I'm sure they were very scary and traumatic for the people who actually experienced them, but a majority of these stories appear to be nothing more than clickbait. From what I've seen, many of these stories have little basis in fact, as most describe an individual, who's usually a man, who seems to appear out of nowhere and follows the would-be victim around the store, but few of these stories can explain how they knew this was trafficking, which has an element of exchange compared to a kidnapping. And looking at the chances of a random person becoming a victim of human trafficking, even if we use the highest estimate of human trafficking in the world, which is 45 million, we find that only half of 1% of the global population meets the definition to be considered a human trafficking victim. At the same time, traffickers do not select random people to traffic, just like robbers do not select random people to rob, and burglars do not select random houses to burglarize. They are all selective and looking for the easiest targets. And if you don't believe me, there's an entire criminal justice theory known as routine activities theory that explains this in great detail. But to me, the logic alone makes sense, and I think you would agree. Additionally, human trafficking is not distributed across the planet evenly. There are variations between genders, age groups, and geography. For example, let us look at the difference between adults and children. Here we find that 70% of trafficking victims are adults, meaning that 3 out of every 10 human trafficking victims are actually kids. And even within these groups, we find differences, with adult women comprising almost half of all trafficking victims at 49%, and adult males making up less than a quarter, with only 21%. Young girls are trafficked at more than 3 times the rate of young boys, with girls making up 23% of all victims. And not surprisingly, women and girls are mostly trafficked for sex, as more than 70% of either group is trafficked for sex. However, what may surprise you is that males make up more than 1 in 20 sex trafficking victims globally, as 6% of all sex trafficking victims are male, with the majority of these being boys. So, females, both young and old, are at greater risk of being trafficked for sex, and males, both young and old, are at a greater risk of being trafficked for labor. But when you do the math, based on population size, children and adults are equally likely to be trafficked. Now, if we take a geographic approach, we find a mess in trying to determine who is at risk based upon geography. Because while 96 different types of nationalities are trafficked in North America, there are also domestic victims comprised of individuals who are citizens of the country where they are being victimized. This is true in every region on the planet, meaning we cannot simply say there is an origin country, and if we avoid it, we will never become a victim, because countries can be origin and destination countries all in one. And in an attempt to try to determine which region of the world has the highest rate of trafficking, we can look at the number of trafficking convictions and number of victims detected per 100,000. Here we discover the top 10 regions display an eerie theme, that most of the regions with higher rates of victimization are countries that are wealthier. This takes place for at least 2 reasons. One, wealthier regions are destination spots because that's where greater money can be made. This is why we see Western and Southern Europe, along with North America, outpacing the rest of the world and victimizing more citizens from other countries than any other region by far. Two, these regions have more resources and are better prepared and willing to identify victims and prosecute the traffickers. So we end up seeing higher numbers because while these regions import high rates of victims and maintain domestic victims at even higher rates, they still address the problem with more resources, including training, funding, and tracking incidences. As we continue to better understand the risk of being trafficked, it is important to remember in every region of the world, except Western Europe, that countries traffic far more of their own citizens than those from other countries. In the US, at least 74% of victims in the country are US citizens. Now, for the sake of time and to wrap all of this up, we're not going to go into every specific variable that increases someone's risk of being a human trafficking victim. But a short list should include vulnerable populations who have no voice within society, because these individuals are going to be excluded from having certain legal protections, and traffickers are aware and they will target them. Other risks include poverty, mental illness, and for juveniles, being in foster care and running away from home and engaging in survival sex are strong risk factors. Now, some studies have even found that race can impact the possibility of being trafficked. In one U.S. study, multiracial U.S. citizens were almost 3 times more likely to be trafficked than white citizens. That was a lot to throw at you at the end there, but hopefully the vulnerable population stood out, because that really is what makes it possible for traffickers to threaten, force, and coerce millions into modern day slavery. So, yes, you should be aware when you are at the store, but it is far more likely that you will be targeted as you fit into certain demographics and based upon where you live, and mostly dependent upon how vulnerable you are. Hopefully, this helped you to better understand who is at risk of human trafficking. Thank you for listening to Human Trafficking Hater. If you're interested in getting more content about human trafficking, how to address it, and how it impacts millions around the world, please subscribe and join us as we continue to hate human trafficking and raise awareness.